I didn't care after I did Roots if I ever worked again in life, because that is in the industry, because I felt like this is it. This is as good as it's going to get. Well, actually, it wasn't the first writing job I had. I was writing for a local show called Loman and Barkley, which was on NBC, a couple of radio personalities. The network gave them an hour and a half on, I think it was on Saturday nights, and we formed an ensemble of writer-performers, which included Craig T. Nelson, Rudy DeLuca, who would go on to write High Anxiety with Mel Brooks, the late McLean Stevenson, Barry Levinson, who won an Academy Award, etc., and several other performers, all of whom had fairly successful careers. And while I was writing on that show, I got an offer to be a writer on the Leslie Uggam show. Leslie had a one-hour variety show, and in the context of that one-hour variety show, there was a 15-minute mini sitcom called Sugar Hill. And this focused on a black family that lived in Harlem in this area called Sugar Hill. And Leslie insisted that she have an African-American writer. And the producers told her, well, there aren't any, with the exception of myself, who was writing for the local show. So I got the offer to write for the Leslie Uggam show, and of course I accepted it. And that was the beginning of my writing career at the network level. I was never to get another job writing at the network level, but I learned a great deal about writing for television, working with the writers on her show. And years later, of course, Leslie and I were to work together again in Roots, and she played my daughter, Kizzy. So it was the beginning of a wonderful, long relationship. Gordy was contrary to most of the roles that were being given to African-American actors at the time, in that he wasn't a stereotype. He wasn't he wasn't not an athlete, which was one of the running gags on the show. Phyllis, as played by the incredible Cloris Leachman, assumed that because of his size and the fact that he was black, that he was a sportscaster, when in fact he was a meteorologist, which got under Ted Knight's skin a little bit, particularly when I got my character, that is, got the big offer to go to New York and make big bucks, working for one of the big network or one of the affiliates. And we got a lot of mileage out of that. But I loved the character because there was no, the producers, Alan Burns and Jim Brooks, they were such class acts. They didn't pander to the lowest common denominator. They did not go for the obvious race jokes that every other writer in the business seemed to be going for, which I thought were cheap laughs and boring at best. So they really made this character three-dimensional. And had I not gone on to do Good Times after that show, they probably would have developed a family. They talked about him having a wife and a child. That never happened because, as I said, I got another offer, I think, into the second or third year of the Mary Tyler Moore show, and went over to CBS for the Good Times show. I don't know. I couldn't define it other than to say that she's a consummate professional. She had a great sense of comedic timing, and she's very vulnerable. And she never had any hang-ups about being the star of the show. We all realized it was an ensemble, and that it was her show, and we were all like just hubs. I mean, satellites, and she was the hub. She was the glue that held the show together. And of course, her husband, Grant Tinker, had cast an incredible ensemble. Everybody on that show went on. The proof of it is everybody on the show spun off into their own show ultimately. Ted Knight, Ed Asner, the entire cast, Murray, they all went on to have their own shows, including Rhoda, of course. So she was surrounded by a wonderful ensemble of actors who could handle the more poignant moments as well as the comedic side. And as I said, the writing was wonderful. To me, it's a yardstick by which most sitcoms could not measure up to today. It was a different time, and these guys raised the bar. They raised the bar pretty high. I know I was learning from every actor that I've worked with, even up until this day. I think every time I interact with either an ensemble or just one or two other actors, it's always a learning experience. There's nothing new under the sun. I don't know if they learned anything from me, but I certainly learned from them comedic timing, and no one was about telling the other actors how to do their job or how to perform their roles, but we were all very trusting of each other and very giving. It was a very professional cast from that standpoint. Everybody knew the meaning of reciprocity, that no scene could be as good as it could be unless we both understood that it was give and take. Yeah. There were only one or two incidents during the various episodes that I did on the Mary Tyler Moore Show, none of which came from the production staff or from my fellow actors. Actually, it was just one character, and and his tenure with the show was short-lived after he made a very racist remark. And I just looked at the guy when he said it. I think it was something to the effect of, "Smile so we can know you're in the room." And I looked at him, and Alan Burns and Jim Brooks looked at the guy, and he was gone the next day. Never saw him again. For one thing, Esther Roll was offered the show, and Esther insisted that it not be a matriarch. Otherwise, I would not have had a job. She said, "I want a husband on the show, and I want to." She had told Norman Lear, so they began to audition male actors for the role of her husband. And after I read for Miss Roll with Norman Lear, she turned to him right in the room and said, "He'll do just fine. I'd like him to be my husband." And I said, "Great, you know, it was wonderful. Primetime series and a co-starring role. It was wonderful. It was a tremendous opportunity for me." And the problems began later when the writers became, I thought, a little lazy, and they became more concerned with seeing how little they could write by having JJ come into the room and walk funny and wear a chicken hat or something, which meant that they didn't, and say dynamite, which meant that they didn't have to write any dialogue for maybe another page or two. And if you could drop that dynamite phrase in and have them walk to the room 2 or 3 times during the course of a 24-minute segment, allowing for bumpers and ads, it was a cakewalk for them. But the show began to slide downhill, I felt, in terms of its quality, because they didn't develop the characters of the other 2 children in the show. That is, Michael, my youngest son, on the show is played by Ralph Carter, who incidentally had won I think a Tony on Broadway before. That's when Norman Lear saw him. He was doing Raisin, the musical. And Ralph Carter had an incredible voice. Not that he ever got to sing that much on the show. And then, of course, there was Bernadette Stannis, who played my daughter, who was a beautiful young actress and had a natural ability for comedy as well as the more poignant moments. So he had cast the show very well. And that was when our differences began, when I felt that they were catering to the buffoonery. And I was pretty outspoken about it. I was nowhere near, I'd like to think, as mature as I am now about making decisions and voicing my differences. To me, coming out of football and boxing, it was about, well, let's take it outside. You know, I didn't have a lot of tact or diplomacy, but I didn't mind, you know, as they say, throwing down if it came to that. And the writers got tired of my attitude, and ultimately I got a phone call from Norman's office while we were on hiatus, I think just about to go into the 3rd season on the show, and he told me, "I've got some good news for you and some bad news. What do you want first?" I said, "Hey, it's your dime. You made the call." He said, "Well, the good news is the show's been picked up for another season," which was pretty much a foregone conclusion because we were never out of the top 10 once we established our time slot. And he said, "But the bad news is you won't be with us." And I didn't respond. And he said, "John, you still there?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Well, don't you have anything to say?" I said, "No, what can I say? I mean, if you want to fire me, it's your show." And he did. Ultimately, he said, "Well, we feel you're becoming a disruption." And the reason I was becoming a disruption is because, as I said, I was very outspoken about the direction that the show was going in, and I didn't want to be part of that. It was perpetuating a lot of, I felt, negative stereotypes, ethnic stereotypes, and I didn't want to be part of that. So ultimately, they did kill the character off, James. To this day, I don't know exactly how the character died. There's conjecture about it. Some folks contend that he died in an automobile accident, that he froze to death on the pipeline up in Alaska. Other folks say he got killed in a car crash in Mississippi. I don't know because I didn't attend the funeral or the autopsy. I don't know how the character passed, but I had a nice run on the show. As I said, towards the end of it, it was not a great place to work for me. There were a lot of personality differences, and I felt that we had lost the focus, which was the family as a whole and not just, buffoonery. I agree with him to a certain degree. Yeah, you have to have a comedic foil, but I didn't go along with the fact that he was a comedic foil to the expense of the other two characters, the other two children. Bernadette Stannis, who played Thelma, she aspired to become a surgeon, I believe. And Ralph, I thought there was a lot of mileage they could have gotten out of the fact that he was called the militant midget because he was so astute about the political process in the country and those who had been disenfranchised, and he aspired to become a Supreme Court justice. So I thought that, and I made it clear as to what my feelings were, that how many more chicken hats, and how long can we do this? And as I said, I wasn't the most tactful guy in the world, so I don't blame Norman Lear or the writers for saying, well, let's get rid of John Amos and see if the show continues. And it did. For a couple of years, I think. The ratings went down, but that might have just been normal television fickleness. Audiences get tired and they have other choices. So, but the bottom line is we did make some shows that I'm exceptionally proud of. The show in which JJ got shot, for example, was sort of a harbinger of things to come with gang violence. The fact that we covered subject matter like seniors being forced to eat cat food or dog food because of the economic stress that they were under and not having sufficient benefits to eat proper meals. We covered one show. I saw an episode some months ago. I don't normally watch my own work, but this episode intrigued me because it dealt with bad food being sold in minority neighborhoods in supermarkets. And the way we paid that off, Esther and I went to the supermarket where she'd gotten this bad cut of meat, and she prepared it for the supermarket manager, and we sat there and served it to him. He was reluctantly ate it, but he ate it, and that was sort of a payback. So at times, that let me know what we could do in terms of television, even on a sitcom. We could get a wonderful message across on various subjects. And Norman always had his finger on the pulse of what the public wanted. But by then, he had 5, 6, maybe 7 shows, so his personal TLC was not there. And we began to feel a lack of it as the show went on, to the point that it really became something less than what I wanted to be involved with. So when they killed me off, it was the right time for me to go. But as God would have it, less than 6 months later, I got a call from my agent who said, David Walper wants you for Alex Haley's book, Roots, the miniseries, and the rest is sort of, as they say, history. It was an intelligent show at times. Other times, of course, we didn't go for a heavy message and it was just sheer entertainment. But even under the umbrella of entertaining people, we got messages across about kids making choices about drugs. There was one show in which JJ, I believe, he had a thing. He had a very strong affection for a young lady who happened to be addicted. And that came out in the show. And it was just like a little slice of life, in that we would add just enough reality, but then coat it with humor so that folks wouldn't get turned off, but they would still get the message. You don't see that today. I think today most of the sitcoms are indistinguishable one from the other. I don't watch that much TV anymore, with the exception of shows in which I can learn something, Animal Planet, PBS, and not pandering to the fact that this is a PBS show, but let's face it, you learn something. And unless I needed to put me to sleep at night because I suffer from chronic insomnia, I leave the tube off and grab a book. Yeah, well, prior to Good Times, I don't think most of Americans, certainly not television viewers around the world, which I later found out we had a global following, they had never seen a family, an actual family in the projects. And the thing that made it Good Times unique was before Esther indicated to Norman that she definitely wanted a husband, up until then, any family that had been shown on TV, any black family or African-American family, had been a matriarch, which was America's popular misconception as to, to some degree based on statistics. But I grew up in a small town in East Orange, New Jersey, which at that time was voted the cleanest city in the United States of America 2 years running in a magazine, a little magazine called Life magazine. And the bottom line is I was very proud to be raised in that city. I got a wonderful education. Our teachers were amongst the best at East Orange High School. And if you took the right courses, college prep courses they called them, and you took the right courses, you could go on to any school in the country, Ivy League, Big Ten, whatever. It's since been dismantled. The school no longer exists. And they tore the school down, and in its place is, I think, called the East Orange Campus School. But the good thing about it is that Cicely Tyson is one of the administrators and one of the instructors there. She, along with, I think Leslie sticks her head in the door every once in a while. But the bottom line is, out of something, what I thought was bad, something good came. So all in all, as I look back on Good Times, which I must insist, how much longer can I dwell on something that happened 30 years ago or more? I did move on to other shows, and they were wonderful experiences as well, i.e. The West Wing and the other experiences I had with some incredibly talented writers. With the exception of Diane Carroll, who had starred in Julia as a nurse, it perpetuated the stereotype of what we called the fat black mammy syndrome, which has been perpetuated through history and through history books. See, I was one of four students to integrate the school system in East Orange, New Jersey, at a very young age. And my textbooks, the very textbooks that my mom's taxes were paying for, were helping to perpetuate those stereotypes. I distinctly remember one illustration of a slave, a very popular illustration, had an enormous body and a head about the size of a peanut, which was it was implicit that, oh, you have tremendous brawn and athletic ability, but you have no brains. And I was raised part of my life in the South. I would go to Birmingham, Alabama during the summers, where I found my family lineage was absolutely antithetical to what I was being taught. I found out I did come from a mercantile heritage and that my aunt and uncle, my mother's sister, and her brother-in-law had what would be the equivalent of a mini mall in those days, and that was due in part to segregation. If a black woman wanted to get her hair done in those days, she had to go to an African-American beauty parlor, which was run by my aunt, who was a licensed cosmetologist. Next to the beauty parlor, they had Mr. and Mrs. Gregory's grocery store, where they made sandwiches, sold groceries, and then right next to that, they had Mr. Gregory's cobbler shop, where he could make shoes from scratch. And I would defy Florsheim or Stacey Adams or anybody else to distinguish between the quality of the shoes that he made. So that let me know that, and they bought a new Oldsmobile every 2 years. I mean, they owned their own home, 2 or 3 bedroom home, right on the main drag in Birmingham, Graymont Avenue, I believe it was. And I saw the respect that the vendors had for them when they came to the store with their crates of milk and their boxes of bread and the other staples that she sold in the store. They called her Morning Miss Gregory, Morning Mr. Gregory, whereas everybody else of color was, hey boy, hey uncle, hey gal, I mean, all the derogatory, put downs that they could come up with in passing. But because my aunt and uncle were people of substance and they wanted to keep that cash flow going, they gave them their respect. And that was a lesson for me. But ironically enough, as soon as I would get on the train and get back to Newark, New Jersey, the subtle racism would start. Step off the sidewalk or getting pulled over by the police or stop and frisk was just part of the routine. I mean, if you walk down the street too fast, too slow, or whatever, hey, boy, up against the wall. And that went on. So you learn your survival instincts when you have to spend some time in the South. You learn how to conduct yourself, how to carry yourself, and you bring those survival instincts back north with you, or vice versa. So part and parcel of growing up in America. I could recite chapter and verse. I could go on and on and on about incidents that happened in L.A., even while I was working on the Mary Tyler Moore Show. My face hadn't become quite as well known as it would be later, but I was at a friend's house in the Valley, and he was a mechanic, and I was hopeful that he would fix my Volkswagen bus, my engine. So I guess I hung around in front of his house too long, and the LAPD, or at least the San Fernando Valley Police, pulled me out of the car, choked me to the point of unconsciousness, took me to the police station in cuffs and manacles, where the warrant officer asked for my autograph while I was being booked. I couldn't believe this. And when I asked him, I said, "What is this about?" He said, "Well, what are you doing in this neighborhood this time? Well, how come you're hanging out here so long?" And I said, "I'm waiting for a friend of mine, Cliff, who lives here, to come and see if he can fix my car." He didn't buy that. So, as I said, they pulled me out of the car, manacled me, handcuffed me, choked me to the point of unconsciousness. When I woke up, I was being booked at the San Fernando Valley Police Station. But had it been Birmingham, I could have been beaten or lynched. So that's the way, and I don't think young people today particularly even understand what that era was about. The fact that if I wanted to see another black face at CBS, I had to pull out a hand mirror. And had it not been for Leslie Uggams very tactfully suggesting that they find a black writer, I never would have gotten that opportunity to write at the network level. And I don't know what invaluable contribution I made to her show, but it was nice to know that there was a young, beautiful, talented lady who was standing up saying, if we're going to do a black sitcom in the context of this variety show, can you find me a black writer, please? It's supposed to be about a black family, and I'd like to capture those nuances, etc. So it was very brave on her part to stand up then and say, find me a black writer. And it was based on the fact that I had been visiting and living periodically for increments of time in Liberia, West Africa. And I'd gone there initially to produce and direct a documentary on the Grambling College Marching Band, who had been invited to the inauguration of then President Talbert. And we got the documentary done. We couldn't find a buyer for it in prime time. I think it showed on 2 or 3 stations about 3 in the morning. There was absolutely no interest. But the bottom line was that was my introduction to Africa, to Liberia, and I couldn't have found a better place as a returning, or as an African-American, to return to the continent. I was the first member of my family that ever made it all the way back to Africa, and they spoke the same language, the currency was the same, and the fact that it had a history of slaves who wanted to return to Africa as free human beings, that made it very enticing for me. So I had some wonderful experiences in Liberia, and one of them was that as I began to spend more and more time there, I developed the patois. That is, I developed the lingua franca, which was part English and part Liberian, and I carried that into the audition, the initial audition, years later with David Walper and Stan Margulies when they were casting the role of Kunta Kinte, the African. And I used that accent all through the audition, if you would. And there was some there was some controversy about it, or some, people would, I can't recall exactly who it was that verbalized it. They said, John, what are you doing? I said, I don't understand. What do you mean, what am I doing? This accent you're using, what? I said, let me tell you a story. When I was in Liberia, I was mistaken for a Liberian by a Liberian who had threatened to kill the security guard who had mistreated him when he was working in Boma Hill Diamond Mine. He thought that I was that security guard. And it was only when I produced my California driver's license and began to speak in very, very strong American accent that this guy relinquished his thought that I was that security guard. I said, now, if I can fool a Liberian, I think it'll work on American television. So I adamantly refused to give up the accent, despite the fact that he told me, well, we had Maya Angelou came in, and she thought she had the accent. We said, no, that won't work. And then Cicely had the accent. And I said, I don't care what the other actors did. That does not affect me. And I was a pretty obstinate actor even then, I guess, or obstinate human being. But it wasn't based on ego. It was based on the fact that I'd passed the litmus test in Africa. So who are you, a director from Beverly Hills, to tell me that it's the wrong accent? And I didn't say it in those words. I just adamantly stuck to the accent, and that's what they used throughout the filming. That's what I chose to use at any rate. Well, I was getting made up, and I had been made up, and they had there was a wardrobe test. So they gave me the shirt and this costume for the character, and I went off to set while they shot another scene. And it was then that whatever it was that happened, where I felt like I had become totally taken by the spirit of my ancestors. I knew what it was intuitively, that it was all my ancestors who had never been spoken of or never been written about properly in the history books, and those millions that had died on the ships on the way over here as slaves. They were speaking to me in so many voices. It was not my imagination, that I was just overwhelmed. And I began to, I became agitated. I was speaking in tongues, they tell me. I was yelling and screaming and flip-flopping on the ground. My friend who was with me at the time, Randy, a childhood friend from New Jersey, he didn't know if I was having an epileptic seizure or what. I never had a history of anything like that. All I know is that the director who was shooting the scene down the hill, he became very agitated. He said, what the hell is going on up there? What's all that noise? And there was no explanation for it other than the one that I've given you, the fact that these were my ancestors speaking to me saying, now you will be our voice, you will speak. And if they want to know what the African spirit is about, you stay resolute, you stay strong, show them you will not break, as we did not break. You will not break Kunta Kinte. And that's what I carried throughout the rest of the project. And at times it became a little much for the director because small things like having lived in Africa as long as I did, I watched the way they carried themselves. And there's so many misconceptions about Africa, particularly about African women. And I noticed this on one of my trips when the bus that carried us from Robertsfield Airport to Monrovia, the capital, when it would pass by the women working in the fields, traditionally they worked bare-breasted. But I noticed as the bus, because it was filled primarily with Europeans and with white Americans, the women would very surreptitiously cover their breasts. They'd continue cutting the weeds, but they would cover their breasts, and then when the bus would pass, they would go back. So it showed me that the modesty they had was contrary to the misconception that all, black women are lascivious and, they run around with their breasts bared. Well, it's a climate and it's tradition. They didn't have the hang-ups that Europeans had about breasts and the fixation they have about bare breasts to the point that they're pumping silicone plastic and who knows whatever, yeast, baker's dozen, I don't know, who knows. But it's that preoccupation with the size of a woman's breast, it didn't exist. It didn't exist. So I saw the modesty, and I also saw small things that I would carry into the character, like the way they carried water, not by the handle of the bucket, but on their heads, the way they do in a great many developing countries. And when you think about it, and if you check with any orthopedic surgeon, it's the correct way to carry a heavy weight on top of the head so that the entire body supports the weight. And it only became a matter of discussion when my character is carrying water back. Kunta Kinte is, in the context of the scene, is carrying water back to the plantation or his quarters or something. I put the bucket on top of my head and very lightly steadied it with my hand. And the director said, "John, what are you doing?" I said, "Excuse me?" And I said in the accent, I was so deep into Kunta Kinte at that time, I didn't know who he was or what he was asking me. And I realized he was asking me, why am I carrying the water? I said, "It's the only way to carry the water, man." And he looked like, I can't get through to this guy. So he left me alone. I carried the water like that on top of my head. See, that's when I felt that the director had become intrusive, because he was leaning on the fact that he was a director, and right or wrong, he was going to get the point across to me that I'm directing this, you do this the way I want to. I said, no, I'm not. And I'm not going to do it, I thought to myself, because the character had been described as recalcitrant, as a militant, as what they construed as a militant. He was a man that knew who he was. He knew his name, he knew his culture, he knew his family roots, pardon the pun. He knew who he was, and he was not an actor who was just filling a role in hopes that he wouldn't offend anybody, in hopes of getting another job. I didn't care after I did Roots if I ever worked again in life, because that is in the industry, because I felt like this is it. This is as good as it's going to get. And Louis Gossett and I, God bless him, we were sitting under a tree in this, prior to the scene in which his character, Fiddler, passes away. And I remember him, he broke character, and we both broke character, and he said, "John, we better eat this up like a good steak, because we're never going to get a piece of meat like this again in our careers." Of course, he went on to win the Academy Award for Officer and a Gentleman, and justifiably so. He's a wonderful, wonderful actor and a wonderful human being. He's got a great book out now called An Actor and a Gentleman, which is a play on an officer and a gentleman. So Louis was a source of tremendous strength and support, and he was a mentor to my character. He taught Kunta Kinte, that his Fiddler did, his character, how to survive as a slave, how to be obsequious, how to please the master. And in real life, my aunt and uncle taught me, when I would go to Alabama, how not to irritate the white power structure, how to step off the sidewalk if a white woman or a white man comes down, step into the street, let them have it, because they are the quote-unquote superior race, or at least that's what was being perpetuated. But it really came home to me the first time I went to Alabama. And like any little kid, when we got on the bus, I wanted to see how the bus driver worked the levers and drove the bus. And I sat plopped in the seat right, being born and raised in New Jersey, I plopped in the seat right behind the driver. And my aunt, Miss Gregory, who owned 3 very successful businesses, snatched me by the collar and pulled me to the back of the bus, which was crowded. And I said, "Auntie, why we got to sit?" She said, "Shut up, boy." And I looked and I saw the sign that said colored. It was an orange sign with white lettering on it. I'll never forget it. White on one side and colored on the other in the back. And we were jammed back there like so many bags of dirty clothes. And up front, in front of this sign, I think there was one white person sitting. And I said, "Auntie, why we got to?" She said, "Shush, just hush." And that was my first lesson in legalized apartheid or segregation. Because in New Jersey, we didn't have it. You knew where you would welcome and where you would not go, but there were no signs saying colored and white fountains. And a whole generation has grown up not knowing what legislated segregation was about and the impact it had on you. I mean, you every day you were being given a subtle and sometimes not so subtle lesson, and in the fact that you were less than a human being, you were less than a citizen, and you would do what you were told, or you would be punished for it, maybe beaten, maybe killed, maybe hung. And after Emmett Till was brutally murdered one summer when he was visiting from Chicago, And you might remember the story. He was a 12-year-old, and he had made the mistake of whistling at a white woman in Mississippi. Well, the Klan came for him that night, and they beat him unmercifully and hung him, and then dropped his body in a swamp with a jute mill saw fan around his neck to keep the body from the murder. But ultimately, it came out, and I saw his picture, which was in every major black publication in the United States and around the world at the time. Grotesque. I was terrified to go to Alabama that summer. I told my mother, I said, Ma, I don't want to go. They'll kill me down there. She said, you just do what Big Auntie tells you to and what Uncle Gregory tells you to, and you'll be fine. But the entire time I was down there, I had my head on a swivel. I was scared. And then I began to imagine, well, they're going to kill us because you're successful, because you got business and you got a new car. They don't like that. And you begin to develop a sense of the realities of racism to the point that you get terrified. And as a child, it can have a tremendous impact. So I think that's one of the things that led me to want to become a writer, because I remembered the old axiom, the pen is mightier than the sword. And having integrated 2 schools in New Jersey, I knew it just wasn't a Southern thing, that the racism and the that I was feeling and being subjected to was a national situation. It was a global situation. And people in the North like to dump it all on the South and say, well, you don't want to go down South. Those Southerners, they aren't. Well, it was the same thing in the North. I mean, the only difference was the accent and the fact that it was legislated. But there were jobs we could not get. There were places we could not go, even in New Jersey, my own hometown. And to this day, as recently as a few years ago in the area I live in New Jersey, I had an overt case of racism. And it still pops up every once in a while, but it was a neighbor who, unbeknownst to her, I was in Stansville, what they called at the time in the military. I was in Kyrgyzstan, Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, a few other stands, doing a meet and greet with the troops who were fighting for democracy, only to come home and find out that my next door neighbor had taken up a petition to get, quote unquote, the nigger out of the neighborhood. It blew my mind. I said, my God, at that time, this was the year 2000 or 2001 or 2. And I said, this is not Birmingham, Alabama. This is Califon, New Jersey. What is going on? So I almost reverted to form. But then I said, no, this is an older woman, and her time here on earth hopefully is drawing to an end. So her thinking and her voice won't be prevalent going into the millennium. And it all worked out. Now I've got a wonderful neighbor, a young police officer. I won't mention his name, but suffice to say he's more like a younger brother to me, and he's Italian, and he loves his family, and he loves to see everybody get a fair shake. And he watches my place the same way he watches, when I'm out of town, the same way he watches his own house. But I won't, as I said, out of protection for his privacy, I won't call his name, but he's a neighbor from heaven, he and his family. I guess it's God's way of rewarding me for not committing an act of homicide against those people that wanted to, quote, get me out of the neighborhood. And the thing that really ticked me off is I'm overseas along with some other young men who had taken the vow, to protect this country from enemies both foreign and domestic. And we're all dodging rockets and rocket launchers together. And I come home to find out that this is what I've got for a neighbor, referring to the earlier incident. Well, it had an impact, but if you're talking about the trickle down to the actors from being in the #1 show of all time, it didn't happen, which showed me that there was still a hardcore of, quite frankly, racists in Hollywood that maintaining that old conviction, America doesn't want to see this. In fact, the misconception of Roots was that the executive in charge of production was so overjoyed that of the incredible breakthrough project that we'd come up with that he said, we've got to air this on consecutive nights. His thinking was not that. We found out later it was like, oh man, This is really going to bomb. Let's get this over with. Up until then, no miniseries had been shown on consecutive nights. Thornbirds, Rich Man, Poor Man, or whatever. And even those that were to come later, none was shown on but they decided, look, let's get this over with. We've shot it. Nobody's going to watch this. They closed the casinos in Vegas when Roots aired. Nobody was on the streets. And if you remember, I do believe there was divine intervention when Roots aired, because living or working in the Chicago area, you got to remember, it's the heaviest snowstorm in recorded history all along the eastern seaboard, where all your major markets are located. You couldn't get out of your house. You literally could not leave the house. There was no way, because the snow was up to the windows. It was like God was saying, you're going to watch this. You are going to watch this program, and you're going to watch it this week. Leslie will testify, Leslie Uggams that is, that she was performing in Vegas. And I love when she recounts the fact that Ann Margaret came to her and said, Leslie, there's nobody at my show. There's nobody at the casinos. You guys are closed. She said, what do you mean? She said, Roots is on. I'm going up to my room and watch it right now. So, yeah, we had an impact. But in terms of there being quid pro quo or all the actors in the program getting other offers, or the multitude of offers that you would think would come in from being in a hit show, it didn't happen. In fact, there was a writer for one of the Chicago papers, I think his name was Gary Deeb. I can't recall, but it's something to the effect of, he pointed his finger at Hollywood and said if there were really equality in Hollywood, all of these actors, all of them, to a person, would have spun off into multi-picture deals and been in this and been in that, because they all did a superb job. And I was grateful for his observation, but I also had to live with the reality of Hollywood really doesn't care. And that's when I got back to writing and performing projects of my own that held my interest, not just from an ethnic standpoint, but that addressed issues that I wanted to address. So I came up with the concept of Halley's Comet, my one-man show that I've been touring the world with, in which I portray an 87-year-old man who, as a child of 10, sat on his father's shoulders when the comet came through. And in 1986, he's now an octogenarian himself in his 80s, and he's making his way up to the same hilltop, the same mountaintop, where he sat on his father's shoulders some 76 years earlier. And he conveys to the audience, of course, and to the comet, what has transpired in his life and most of our respective lives in the past 76 years since he last saw the comet. And that gave me the opportunity to portray a multitude of characters that I'd never been given the opportunity to portray before. Not out of vindictiveness or anything, but these were, like any other actor, things I wanted to try. I wanted to see if I could portray a redneck lieutenant, which I do in the show. I wanted to see if I could portray a tough Italian sergeant, who I had when I was a member of the New Jersey State National Guard. And all of these men, and some of the women that I met growing up and in my own family, they left an impact on me, and I borrowed from them nuances and little character traits that helped me flesh out a Halley's Comet, the one-man show. So I've had one heck of a run, man. I've had a wonderful, wonderful run. No complaints here. As I look back, it's been an incredible journey. To play Admiral Percy Fitzwallace, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, for a guy that never rose above the rank of private in the National Guard, that in itself was an accomplishment, okay? I was in the Cub Scouts, and I never even got past tenderfoot. So here I am playing the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and the beautiful thing about that was prior to doing, I can't recall which episode it was, but I think it was about the third or fourth episode I'd done. I happened to be in D.C., and the word got to me that I could meet with Colin Powell, who was then Secretary of State. And so I and my then fiancée went up to his office, and we sat very patiently and waited in his outer office. And this man came striding through the door. I wanted to jump to attention as soon as he came through the door. And he looks at me and he says, Percy Fitzwallace? What kind of name is that for a brother? And I mean, he totally disarmed me. I fell out. You know, we laughed, and then we went into his office, his inner office, and he called his wife, and he said, honey, you'll never guess who I'm sitting here talking to. And I turned to my fiancée and I said, she'll never guess who he's talking to. I'm talking to Colin Powell, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs and Secretary of State. So he commended me on what he thought was a job well done. And when I went back to the West Wing to do subsequent episodes, I carried that with me. That sense of, I know better now who this man is. He's a human, you know, he's three-dimensional. He's not just a cardboard cutout. And he's got a sense of humor. And I didn't get too many opportunities to show that in the writing. But I loved the writing on that show because we all, whenever I see any of the cast members like Valerie Harper and I remain friends to this day, though we appeared on Mary Tyler Moore's show together, she always comments on, she said, Gordy, I never knew you had that character in you, that West Wing character. And I said, well, thank you. And she says, but man, you were really military. I said, well, the man was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. What did you expect, you know? But once you put that uniform on, with all that salad dressing, I mean, so much so you almost leaned to one side. I said, my God. The uniform itself, I didn't have to say a word. I just had to stand there with that uniform on. Because the feeling of empowerment to know that I can call down a squadron of F-16s, you know, and with just a phone call, or I can call my boys and remove you from power, you evil dictator, you know. I mean, it's a great, great feeling. There's a hell of an ego stroke. So I enjoyed it, but we said to each other, the actors, I remember in passing, we said, you know, you have to learn to do this show properly. You have to learn how to speak Sorkinese. That is the way Aaron Sorkin wrote. Because he didn't write traditional dialogue, you know, I talk, you talk, pause, then we talk, or somebody else. No, we overlapped, and he wrote sentences, and when you read it, it didn't make sense, but when you said it, you said, yeah, that's the way we talk. That's the way people really, he had captured that. And I had never experienced that quality of writing, dramatic writing, before in my career, and it was one hell of an experience and a great lesson, because I've always appreciated good writing. I've been blessed that way, having worked with, as I said, Alan Burns, Jim Brooks, Norman Lear, and various other tutors, if you would, that taught me the skill of acting is really based on the quality of the writing that you're given the words to say. I don't know how many actors, I can only speak for myself. I had done extensive research, as I said, prior to being offered the opportunity to portray Kunta Kinte in Roots. I had visited the continent extensively. I had developed relationships, meaningful relationships, lifelong relationships with various other Africans, students and professors. But the main thing is I put my feet on African soil, and I'd walked not just in Liberia, but I knew what it was, true subjugation, when I went to South Africa while Mr. Mandela was incarcerated. And there was no joke there that you were in the belly of the beast. I mean, it was a terrifying experience for me, terrifying to be in South Africa during that period. They were shooting and killing the kids in Soweto with rubber bullets and real bullets. And the relationships that I established in Soweto while I was there, and I was there not to work on Roots, but I was there then, at that time, to research a project called Shaka Zulu. I had read about this incredible Zulu warrior chieftain, and I wanted to develop a screenplay on him. It was subsequently done by some British company, but the bottom line was, it called for me, I felt, to go to South Africa to meet this one author, Credo Mutwa, who had written the definitive works. He was what they called well, he was a historian, and he had developed a complete lineage of Shaka Zulu's bloodline, his parents, his siblings, the whole 9 yards, and he had nuances that I could never find in any history book. But at the same time I'm interviewing him, or I'd arrived there, I was abruptly and very clearly made mindful of the fact that I was in a system of legislated, enforced apartheid And if I had any illusions or delusions about coming there as a freedom fighter or to enlighten people, it was going to be at the cost of being ejected immediately from the country and subjecting my friends or my acquaintances in South Africa to incarceration or perhaps death. I mean, they made it very, very clear. And my friends made it clear too. John, please. We were stopped one night in Soweto by a police officer, huge fella, who had his service revolver on a lanyard on his hip. And he kept his hand on his hip the whole time, ordered us all out of the car. And the way he spoke to us, me having been born in New Jersey, you know, and having played football and boxed, my blood started to boil. And my friends saw this and they said, no, John, no, please. You'll have us all in Robben's Island if you continue. Let us handle this. So I had to, as a kid, say chill. I had to swallow it. And I watched this member of the South African security force walk into this man's home, place his hand on the man's wife's buttocks as though she were his own personal property, squeezed him very lasciviously, and looked at the man like, I dare you to say something. And that was intolerable to me, so tears were running out of my eyes, and I just left the room. But I saw so many instances of just overt power gone mad that when I got back to Liberia, I was staying with a friend of mine. He was a member, in fact, he was chief of security for the Republic of Liberia, Charles de Shield. Charles is now deceased. And I was staying with he and his wife in their very nice home outside Monrovia. And I was so distraught, I was so torn up inside that he had me sleep in a room away from the house, and I slept in a corner with his pistol in my lap because I was just, man, I was terrified. I was terrified for the better part of a week, and then finally I started to come back to earth, and he said, I'll take the pistol now. It wasn't loaded. Found out later it wasn't loaded. But they had put the fear of God in me in South Africa at that time. And now I see people go there and they come back with these wonderful Pollyanna stories. Oh, everything's fine, you know. It'll never be fine for me there. It was just too much to absorb. Or even bad guys, for that matter, to show that we are not a black monolith. I mean, we have good people, bad people, dumb people, brilliant people, you know, in all races. Well, you're coming to the right guy, John Amos, to find out about that, okay? Right. No, seriously, when Amos and Andy was on TV, my mother would make me watch it from outside the house. I mean, I'd have to watch it in the backyard, looking through my bedroom window at the TV, because I would laugh so hard. I mean, it got physical. My mother said, Amos and Andy's coming on. You go outside. You're not going to break my furniture tonight. I always felt, and I still feel to this day, it's one of the greatest comedies ever written because it was no different than Sergeant Bilko, who had Doberman for a foil. It was no different than Milton Berle's show. And at one point in my career, I worked briefly with Milton Berle. I worked with Richard Pryor. I worked with Jonathan Winters. I worked with some of the great comedic minds of all time. And anything that makes people, it wasn't the fact that they had all these made-up words, malapropisms, is it? I mean, it was funny to me. And yeah, Andy was Kingfish's foil. He was his Doberman. He was the guy that whenever Kingfish came up with a new scam, he'd try it on Andy. So I didn't see that as perpetuating a negative stereotype. Some people did. And then the NAACP got involved, and they got Amos and Andy taken off the air. And they wanted every black character on television to carry an attaché case and wear a suit and a tie, which is, that's taking it to the extreme the other way. You know, that's not truthful either. You've got killers, drug addicts, drug dealers, DNA of all colors. You've got good people, bad people, villains, heroes, heroines, you know, of all colors. So I think that's when television will really arrive, if there's still an audience for television aside from the educational shows, seriously, like PBS or the Animal Planet. But fictionalized television is really being challenged because the people, that viewer out there has so many choices. Reality shows, there's literally a channel for anything that comes across a human being's brain, you know. Left-handed bowlers with muscular dystrophy. I mean, come on, man. What? When does it stop? You know, people who like to knit while their Portuguese hump on their back speaks in Spanish. I mean, it's just madness, man. It's just, you know, how many channels can there be, you know? So anyway, I've had a wonderful run. I've had an absolutely wonderful run. Oh, that's the way I started. Yeah, I started doing stand. Now, this is more than irony. There's a small club in the village called Cafe Wha, W-H-A question mark. Some 35 years ago or so, maybe more, when I would finish working as a social worker in the Brooklyn House of Detention or in the Tombs in Manhattan, to decompress and to get the stench of the prisons off me before I'd go home, I'd shower, put on a fresh shirt and pants, jacket, and I'd go down to the village and I'd try and do stand-up comedy. And the first club I walked into, all those years ago, I asked the owner, I said, "Can I go up tonight?" He said, "Well, what do you do? You sing?" I said, "No, I'm a stand-up comic." He says, "You are? Well, where have you worked?" I said, "I haven't. This has been my first time." He said, "Okay, kid, you got 5 minutes." Cafe Wha, I go up, I do my 5 minutes, I bombed terribly. I didn't want to come out of the house for about a week. I said people are going to be out there with a pole to ride me out of town. But ultimately, I got my courage up, and I went back, and I did a few sets, and I developed some material. Now, flash forward 38, 40 years, and I get an offer to do a play, a new play called Felony Friday, in which I'm playing an indicted killer who has beat a man to death for having an illicit relationship with his wife. And it all takes place in a holding cell, myself and some other miscreants. And the bottom line is our first performance is in a theater located where? In the Cafe Wha, in the village. So that let me know. I said, "God, I understand you have a plan for me." And it's still continuing to unfold. After being cut from 13 professional football teams, including the Chiefs twice, I get a commercial agent when I break into the entertainment industry. And the first commercial I get sent on was for Schmidt's Beer of Philadelphia. I don't even think they brew that beverage anymore. And my agent, my commercial agent at that time, an extremely powerful, very well-respected commercial agency, Cunningham and Associates, they gave me some pages, and I said, "What are these?" They said, "These are the sides." I said, "Sides?" They said, "Yeah, this is a script. This is what you'll be reading when you get to the audition." That's how much of a novice I was. So I go to Burbank, and I walk into the hallway where all the other people are auditioning for this role. And on either side of the hallway, there looks like I'm back in football training camp. And I said, "Well, what is this commercial for?" They said, "Schmidt's Beer of Philadelphia." So I said, but who are we supposed to be? They said, "We're supposed to be professional football players." I said, "I got no chance of getting this job." The director opens the door, my right-handed guy. He looks right down the hall past all these guys. He said, "There, that's what I want. That's the guy right there." I said, "Me?" He said, "Yeah, are you available?" His secretary says, "Are you available next Thursday?" I said, yeah. He said, "Well, you got it." And he closes the door. They call my agent. My agent calls me and says, "Yeah, I don't know what you did, but you got..." I said, "I didn't do anything. I walked into the room." And he said, "You got the commercial." So I got the commercial for Schmidt's Beer Philadelphia. I'm portraying a professional football player in uniform. I get tackled by Dick Bass, who would go on to become a Hall of Fame running back with the Rams, or if not Hall of Fame, certainly All-Pro. And it was just unbelievable. So that's when I realized then that God had a plan for me, and the plan did not include playing professional football, but only portraying a professional football player or developing a repertoire of anecdotes about it and to entertain and write, but not to play football, but to act. and to do what I'd been doing all my life. That got me kicked out of every school I'd ever went to for cutting up and being a character at the wrong time. I'd never seen such a pure comedian. I mean, courageous comedian. He was like a stream of consciousness. And I went away from that relationship, as brief as it was. We had done a pilot together, which did not work, but I got to spend a couple of days with him at the studio and watching him work. And I wondered then, because I was still aspiring to be a stand-up comic at the time, where my forte, I thought, had always been comedy. I hadn't proven my mettle as a dramatic actor as yet. And I said, man, I'll never be that good. I didn't know if I could ever be that honest or that pure, that direct, that stream of consciousness thing that he had going. And I said, too late for me then. I couldn't begin to lace everything I did with profanity the way he did and be as direct and honest as Richard was. But that's what I learned from him, to be true to myself, to do what I do best. And I'd like to think I'm a fairly good storyteller. Haley's Comet has been touring for 22 years now, 21 years. And it's just one long story, the story of an 86-year-old man who's lived long enough to see the comet come twice. So that's what I think I do best, is tell stories. I absolutely prefer the stage. Now, it might sound elitist, but to me, that's the ultimate litmus test. If an actor is to be gauged as to the quality of his or her work, because there's no safety net. And you can't bring your entourage with you. You can't drive your Bentley onto the stage or show people your portfolio. You better bring it. And there are some actors, as my director John Harris would say, you can chase them down the street with a stage play. Oh no, stage? They'll bring a 4-flat 40, man. The idea of getting up totally unembellished, with all the accoutrements that come with being a quote-unquote movie star. You get on the stage, you better bring it. Because that audience is sitting there and they're looking at you, not your ratings, not your clippings, not who you're dating this week, or, the fact that you just got out of rehab or whatever the latest thing is that's selling magazines or papers. They're looking for a stage performance. And I've been blessed in having worked with some of the best actors on stage. I have one anecdote I'd love to share with you. It was my first time I did a Broadway play. God, it's got to be 40-some-odd years ago. And the late Jack Cassidy starred in it initially. It was directed by Carl Reiner. And I had a Broadway legend playing opposite me as my wife. That was my first character role. 40 years ago, I was portraying a 65-year-old man on Broadway. His name was Luther. And Luther was the antithesis of Kunta Kinte, very obsequious. He wasn't a yassa boss, but he was the gardener handyman for a very wealthy advertising executive who lived in one of the very exclusive areas of New York, and that was portrayed by Jack Cassidy, and it was an incredible experience because at the end of our performance, the first night, we got a standing ovation and 7 curtain calls, and as we're taking our bows, my co-star was the late Lillian Heyman, who was a Broadway veteran. Lillian at that time must have been well into her 60s, and I was portraying a character, as I said, about 65. And I said, my goodness, look at this. And we got a standing ovation, except for this one group of men who were seated right in the middle of the audience, who sat there as though they were watching an execution. And I didn't pay them any mind. I'm looking at one woman who had laughed so hard she had literally wet herself. She was embarrassed. She covered herself with a coat, but she wasn't about to leave. And I said, man, we really rocked him. We knocked him out. And she said to me as we were taking our bow, she said, honey, unless that group of men there stands up and applauds, we're history. I said, oh, come on. Who are they? She told me backstage. I said, who are those guys you were talking about that didn't stand up and they didn't laugh the whole night? She said, baby, that's Clive Barnes and his posse. Well, the word posse wasn't in then, but that's Clive Barnes and his followers, all the aspiring Broadway critics. And Clive Barnes ruled Broadway with a stroke of the pen. Plays closed or ran for years on the strength of his critique. And sure enough, I come to the theater the next night, and I go backstage and I'm, the proverbial pops that sits backstage playing, reading the racing form, sitting on the milk crate. He's got the checkered shirt on, the suspenders. And he says, "Where you going, kid?" And I said, "I'm going up to put on my makeup," because I had to wear a body pad and, to fatten up and gray up my hair. I had more of it at the time. And he says, "Oh, you don't have to do the show tonight. You don't have to." I said, "Man, we were that good? We got a night off?" He said, "Oh, you got more than a night off, kid. They posted." I said, "Posted? What does that mean?" He said, "Where did he?" "You're over. It's done. You're toast. They closed the show." I said, "But how could they do that? We got a standing ovation and 7 curtain calls." He said, "Yeah, I'm impressed." And he went back to his racing form. So I go over to this restaurant that they had set aside for the opening night party. And sure enough, the hors d'oeuvres disappeared. The wine glasses disappeared. They rolled the television monitors away. It was like something out of a bad Hollywood novel. When the review came in, the first words out of Clive Barnes' mouth was, "I was at the Royal Theater tonight, and I saw an abomination," and that's it. I'd never heard the rest of the review because they cut the monitors off. Everything disappeared. The hors d'oeuvres, the caviar, the champagne, gone. And we were just a bunch of actors looking for work. So I said, this is not right. There's only one prerequisite for comedy, that people laugh. We didn't offend anybody. People were laughing so hard they were almost passing out. Written by the late Steve Gordon, who wrote Arthur, okay? So the words were there, the performances were there, the direction was there by Carl Reiner. And I looked at Carl Reiner and I said, "How can this be?" He said, "It's Broadway, John." I said, "Well, I don't like Broadway. I've never gone back to Broadway since, but I've been performing around the world with my own one-man show to standing ovations, and nobody's posted. So I'll stay with my own stuff." I tell you, I sit home sometimes and I say, I feel guilty. I said, "Man, can it get any better? I'm doing what I want to do. I'd be doing this anyway." And I've been blessed to work with some of the very best writers, best producers, best directors in the business. And I'm pretty well satisfied with where I am right now. If I get another job or if something comes along that I really, really want to do, fine, I'm there. But I'm not that hungry as I was when I first started anymore. It's not as much fun. It's a different business. I don't understand the business or what passes for talent today. I really don't. I understand, from an intellectual standpoint, but from where I've been to work with some of the Mary Tyler Moores, Ernest Borgnine's. I conducted a seminar recently in Park City, Utah for some young aspiring actors. And I told the group, I said, "You really want to learn your craft as an actor? Go study some of the actors who've succeeded." I said, so the one young lady, I guess she's about 18 or 19, says, "Well, who are some of the actors you worked with that you were?" I said, "Ernest Borgnine for one." She said, "Who?" I said, "Ernest Borgnine? I never heard of him." I said, "Never mind." I see, this was going to be an exercise in futility, How about Spencer Tracy, who I'd never worked with, but who I admired? And she said, "Who?" I said, "That's it. I'm out. There's nothing I can teach you guys. I might as well be speaking in Martian, I'm a creature from another planet."